The ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral had witnessed 6 centuries of human folly, but never had they seemed to brood with such particular malevolence as they did on that grey November evening. The great restoration project, 3 years in the making, was finally complete. The medieval stained glass windows, masterpieces that had survived the Reformation, the Blitz, and countless smaller indignities, now blazed with renewed glory, their colors as vivid as the day master craftsmen had first set them in lead and stone. It should have been a triumph. The cathedral's restoration committee had labored tirelessly to raise the substantial funds required, and tonight's dedication ceremony represented the culmination of their efforts. The cream of London society had gathered in the nave, their evening dress creating a counterpoint of earthly elegance against the soaring Gothic architecture. The largest window, a magnificent rose depicting the Last Judgment, cast jeweled patterns across the assembled congregation, while the smaller lancet windows told their stories in sapphire and gold. Canon Theodore Whitmore stood at the lectern, his silver hair catching the light from the windows he had fought so hard to preserve. At 68, he remained a commanding presence, his voice resonating through the vaulted space with the authority of decades spent in service to both God and art. Tonight, however, those who knew him well might have detected a tremor beneath his composed exterior, a tension that had nothing to do with the solemnity of the occasion. "My dear friends," he began, his cultured tones carrying easily to the back of the nave, "we gather tonight not merely to celebrate the restoration of these magnificent windows, but to honor the vision and dedication of those who made this miracle possible." In the front pew sat Lady Pemberton, the formidable chairwoman of the Restoration Committee, her steel-gray hair arranged with military precision beneath a small black hat. Her sharp eyes surveyed the assembly with satisfaction, though those who knew her well might have noticed the way her gloved hands gripped her prayer book with unusual force. Beside her, Mr. Timothy Ashford, the cathedral treasurer, fidgeted with his program, his pale face bearing the perpetual worry lines of a man who dealt in large sums of other people's money. 3 rows back, Miss Caroline Fletcher dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from emotion at the ceremony's beauty or some private sorrow, it was impossible to say. The young woman had devoted herself entirely to the cathedral's charitable works since her father's death 2 years prior, and her dedication had been instrumental in the restoration's success. Near the south transept, Colonel Hartwell sat ramrod straight, his military bearing unchanged despite his 73 years. His weathered hands rested on his walking stick, and his pale blue eyes remained fixed on Canon Whitmore with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. Dr. Marcus Fleming, the art historian who had supervised the restoration work, occupied a seat near the chancel, his scholarly face animated with quiet pride. The project had been his academic triumph, the culmination of a career spent studying medieval glass. Tonight should have been his moment of glory, yet he seemed strangely subdued, his usual enthusiasm dampened by some unspoken concern. The ceremony proceeded with stately grace. Prayers were offered, hymns sung, and appropriate speeches delivered. Canon Whitmore's address was particularly moving, speaking of light conquering darkness, of beauty preserved for future generations, of the sacred trust placed in those who guard such treasures. Yet beneath the ritual's familiar rhythms, a careful observer might have detected undercurrents of tension, glances exchanged, words left unspoken, the subtle signs of a community harboring secrets. As the service drew to its close, Canon Whitmore announced the evening's final element, a private viewing of the restored windows by special illumination, allowing the assembled guests to appreciate the full glory of the medieval craftsman's work. The cathedral's modern lighting system, specially installed for the occasion, would bring out every subtle gradation of color, every delicate detail that daylight might obscure. The congregation rose with a rustle of silk and wool, moving toward the chancel where the most spectacular windows awaited their admiration. Canon Whitmore descended from the lectern, his face bearing an expression of quiet satisfaction as he prepared to lead the viewing. Dr. Fleming approached him with some technical observation about the lighting angles, while Lady Pemberton marshalled her committee members with characteristic efficiency. It was then that the lights failed. The cathedral plunged into absolute darkness with a suddenness that left the assembly gasping. For a moment, the only sounds were the whisper of fabric and the nervous clearing of throats. Then, from somewhere near the high altar, came a different sound, a sharp intake of breath, followed by the dull thud of something heavy striking stone. "The emergency lighting," Dr. Fleming's voice called out, professionally calm despite the circumstances. "There should be—" His words were cut short as pale battery-powered lamps flickered to life, casting wan pools of illumination throughout the nave. The assembled guests blinked in the sudden, inadequate light, their eyes struggling to adjust. It was Lady Pemberton who first noticed that something was amiss. "Where is Canon Whitmore?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to having her questions answered immediately. The answer came not in words, but in a collective gasp as the emergency lighting revealed the scene near the high altar. Canon Whitmore lay crumpled at the base of the great rose window, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his silver hair now dark with blood. Above him, the Last Judgment window seemed to leer down with medieval severity, its restored colors appearing almost garish in the harsh emergency lighting. But it was not the canon's fall that drew the most horrified attention. Scattered around his body were fragments of stained glass. Not ancient medieval glass, but pieces from one of the smaller restoration panels. The fragments caught the light like drops of crystallized blood, their beauty now transformed into something sinister and accusing. Dr. Fleming was the first to reach the fallen canon, his scholarly composure cracking as he knelt beside the motionless figure. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Someone call for help, quickly." But even as footsteps hurried toward the vestry telephone, those gathered around the scene could see that help would be too late. Canon Theodore Whitmore, guardian of 6 centuries of sacred art, lay dead beneath the windows he had fought so hard to preserve. And scattered around him like accusations made manifest were the shattered fragments of his life's work, their colored light now forever dimmed. In the shocked silence that followed, as the reality of what had occurred began to sink in, no one noticed the small, dapper figure who had slipped quietly into the cathedral during the ceremony's final moments. Hercule Poirot stood in the shadows of the north aisle, his egg-shaped head tilted thoughtfully as he observed the scene with those famous grey cells already beginning their inexorable work. The game, as he might have said, had begun. The chaos that followed Canon Whitmore's death possessed that peculiar quality of restrained pandemonium that afflicts the English upper classes when confronted with genuine crisis. Lady Pemberton, true to her commanding nature, immediately assumed control with military precision, her voice cutting through the stunned silence as she directed Colonel Hartwell to secure the cathedral doors while personally summoning the police from the vestry telephone. Her hands trembled only slightly as she dialed, betraying the shock beneath her composed exterior. Dr. Fleming remained kneeling beside the canon's still form, his scholarly hands hovering helplessly over the body, as if his expertise in medieval art might somehow restore life to the dead, while the scattered fragments of stained glass seemed to mock his professional devotion with their transformed beauty, now serving as evidence of violence in a space dedicated to peace. Miss Caroline Fletcher had gone quite pale, her usual composure shattered as completely as the glass at her feet, clutching her prayer book with white knuckles, while her eyes darted between the body and the faces around her with something that might have been recognition rather than mere shock. Timothy Ashford paced nervously near the chancel steps, muttering calculations under his breath, in the manner of a man whose mind seeks refuge in numbers when confronted with Mortality, his pale face bearing the perpetual worry lines of someone who dealt in large sums of other people's money and now found himself contemplating far more serious accounts. The assembled guests clustered in uncertain groups, their evening finery seeming suddenly inappropriate in the harsh glare of the emergency lighting, whispered conversations rippling through the nave as speculations and shock mingled with the practical concerns of those who found themselves potential witnesses to what might be far more than an accident. Within minutes, the heavy oak doors admitted Inspector Meadows of Scotland Yard, accompanied by the police surgeon and several constables, their presence bringing both relief and a grim confirmation of the evening's transformation from celebration to tragedy. Meadows was a competent man in his 50s, possessed of the methodical nature essential to his profession, but perhaps lacking the imagination required for truly complex cases, and his initial examination of the scene proceeded with textbook efficiency as he photographed the body's position, collected the glass fragments, and began taking preliminary statements from the witnesses. His working theory emerged quickly and seemed, on the surface, entirely reasonable as he announced to the assembled group that Canon Whitmore appeared to have suffered a tragic accident, losing his footing when the lights failed and falling to strike his head on the stone floor, with the glass fragments suggesting he had grasped at the window for support, breaking one of the panels in his fall. The explanation satisfied most of those present, offering as it did a rational conclusion to what had been a deeply disturbing event, and Lady Pemberton nodded approvingly while Colonel Hartwell grunted his agreement, and even Dr. Fleming seemed to accept the inspector's assessment with resigned sadness. The restoration project had claimed its guardian in a final, cruel irony, but at least there was no suggestion of deliberate malice, and the cathedral could be reconsecrated, the tragedy mourned, and life could eventually return to normal. It was then that a quiet voice spoke from the shadows near the north aisle, its precise continental accent cutting through the murmur of acceptance like a blade through silk as the speaker stepped into the circle of emergency lighting to reveal himself as a small, immaculately dressed gentleman with an egg-shaped head and magnificent mustaches, whose appearance was so striking, so perfectly foreign yet somehow reassuring, that the assembled company fell silent with the instinctive recognition that someone of importance had entered their midst. Inspector Meadows frowned at this unexpected interruption, his professional pride somewhat ruffled by the challenge to his conclusions, and when he inquired as to the stranger's identity, the small man produced a card with a flourish that somehow managed to be both theatrical and dignified. "Hercule Poirot, at your service," he announced, explaining that he had been attending the ceremony as a guest and could not help but observe certain details that seemed inconsistent with the theory of accidental death. Dr. Fleming looked up with surprise and evident relief, vouching for Poirot's reputation in matters of criminal investigation, and the inspector found himself reluctantly curious despite his initial irritation at civilian interference. Poirot approached the scene with the delicate precision of a cat navigating a room full of precious objects, his grey eyes taking in every detail with methodical thoroughness, from the position of the body to the pattern of the scattered glass, from the angle of the fallen walking stick to the precise location of the bloodstains on the ancient stones. "You will observe, Inspector," he said with the patience of a professor addressing particularly slow students, "that while Canon Whitmore indeed fell and struck his head, the distribution of the glass fragments presents certain anomalies, for if he had grasped at the window for support, we would expect to find the pieces concentrated near the base of the window, yet here we see fragments scattered in a pattern more consistent with deliberate breakage from above." The inspector examined the scene with renewed attention, his professional skepticism warring with growing unease as Poirot continued his analysis, noting that the canon's injuries showed characteristics suggesting he was unconscious before his fall, the blood pattern and position of the limbs indicating a man who did not attempt to break his fall, and, most significantly, the remarkable coincidence of the electrical failure occurring at precisely the moment when Canon Whitmore found himself alone near the altar. Lady Pemberton's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence that followed Poirot's observations, the implications becoming clear to the assembled company and transforming what had seemed a tragic accident into something far more sinister, while Colonel Hartwell's military bearing stiffened as if preparing for battle. Miss Fletcher's already pale complexion became almost translucent, and Timothy Ashford ceased his nervous pacing to stand frozen like a rabbit sensing the approach of a predator. Inspector Meadows found himself reluctantly revising his initial assessment as Poirot's logic became impossible to ignore, the Belgian detective's reputation preceding him, and when the inspector asked whether he was suggesting Canon Whitmore had been murdered, Poirot's response came with the measured certainty of a man accustomed to speaking uncomfortable truths, confirming that the evidence demanded a more thorough investigation before they could determine exactly what had transpired in this sacred place. For the dead deserved nothing less than the complete truth, and the living deserved to know whether a killer walked among them. The transformation of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral from sacred celebration to crime scene proceeded with the methodical precision that Inspector Meadows brought to all his investigations, though he found himself increasingly deferential to the small Belgian detective whose keen observations had so thoroughly dismantled his initial conclusions about Canon Whitmore's death. Poirot moved through the ancient space with the measured deliberation of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex work, his gray eyes absorbing every detail while his hands remained characteristically clasped behind his back, the very picture of contained intellectual energy. The inspector had reluctantly agreed to delay the removal of the body until Poirot could complete his examination, recognizing that the Belgian's legendary reputation for solving impossible cases might prove invaluable in what was rapidly becoming a most perplexing investigation, though his professional pride chafed at accepting civilian assistance, however distinguished the source might be. Within minutes, Poirot had requested a private space for conducting interviews, explaining with his customary courtesy that he preferred the quiet contemplation of human nature to the mere collection of physical evidence, a preference that had served him well in countless previous cases, where the truth lay not in fingerprints or bloodstains, but in the subtle contradictions of human behavior under pressure. The cathedral's small vestry was quickly prepared for this purpose, its confined space redolent with the lingering fragrances of old incense and polished wood, while a single high window looked out upon the darkening cathedral grounds where rain had begun to fall with increasing intensity. Poirot arranged himself at a modest wooden table with his characteristic precision, placing a fresh notepad and meticulously sharpened pencil before him while Inspector Meadows took his position as a silent but attentive observer, his initial resentment gradually giving way to professional curiosity about the Belgian's renowned methods. Lady Pemberton entered first, her formidable composure showing definite signs of strain, though she maintained her characteristic bearing with the determination of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations through sheer force of personality. Her steel-gray eyes, usually so penetrating and assured, now flickered with something that might have been apprehension as she settled herself in the chair opposite Poirot, her gloved hands gripping her prayer book with unconscious intensity. "Lady Pemberton," Poirot began with gentle courtesy, "my sincere condolences on this tragic loss, for your devotion to Canon Whitmore and to this cathedral is well known throughout London." She acknowledged his words with a curt nod, her voice steady as she replied that the canon had been a good man, though perhaps at times rather set in his ways, a comment that Poirot noted with particular interest for its subtle suggestion of recent disagreements or tensions within the Restoration Committee. When questioned about her movements during the crucial moments of darkness, Lady Pemberton recounted her actions with military precision, explaining that she had been standing in the front pew when the lights failed, then had moved toward the chancel with the rest of the congregation, experiencing only the sudden plunge into blackness, followed by the sound of Canon Whitmore's fatal fall. Her account seemed comprehensive, yet Poirot detected something held in reserve, a hesitation that suggested knowledge she had not yet shared, and when he pressed gently about any distinctive sounds she might have heard just before or after the electrical failure. She paused for a fraction of a second too long before insisting she had heard nothing beyond the general confusion and the terrible thud of the cannon's body striking stone. Timothy Ashford's interview revealed a man whose nervous energy had transformed into something approaching panic as the full implications of the investigation became clear, his pale face now bearing a sheen of perspiration despite the cathedral's chill, while his hands trembled visibly as he attempted to maintain his composure under Poirot's patient questioning. His account of the evening's events came in stammering bursts, punctuated by defensive protests about his meticulous record-keeping and absolute honesty in all financial matters. Yet Poirot's experienced eye detected the telltale signs of a man harboring guilty knowledge. Though whether that guilt related directly to Canon Whitmore's death or merely to the kind of minor financial irregularities that often plagued charitable organizations remained to be determined through more detailed investigation. Dr. Fleming approached the interview with the nervous energy of a scholar thrust into circumstances far removed from his usual academic pursuits, his hands gesturing unconsciously as he explained the technical details of the electrical system that had so conveniently failed at the crucial moment. His professional expertise had led him to supervise the installation personally, testing every circuit that very afternoon to ensure perfect operation for the evening's ceremony, making the subsequent failure either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of deliberate sabotage by someone with both access to the cathedral and knowledge of the wiring system. As he spoke, Poirot observed with interest how the scholar's dedication to technical precision might paradoxically have provided him with the very knowledge necessary to engineer the blackout that had concealed Canon Whitmore's murder, while his obvious distress seemed genuine enough to suggest either innocence or exceptional acting ability. Miss Caroline Fletcher's composure finally cracked completely under the strain of the evening's events, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she spoke in broken whispers about Canon Whitmore's kindness and the impossibility that anyone could have wished him harm. Yet, even as she grieved, Poirot noticed how her eyes darted toward specific members of the group with an intensity that suggested knowledge or suspicions she had not yet voiced. Her obvious distress appeared genuine enough to rule out immediate guilt, but her nervous glances and carefully guarded responses indicated she possessed information crucial to understanding the victim's final days and the complex web of relationships that had culminated in his violent death beneath the very windows he had labored so faithfully to preserve. Colonel Hartwell maintained his military bearing throughout the questioning, his weathered face revealing nothing, while his pale blue eyes continued their systematic survey of the proceedings with the tactical awareness of a career soldier assessing potential threats and opportunities. When Poirot inquired about his observations during the ceremony, the colonel's responses came with clipped precision, noting that he had indeed observed several individuals moving about during the final hymn, ostensibly positioning themselves for better viewing of the illuminated windows, though his habitual attention to exits and crowd dynamics had led him to notice what might have been a brief scuffle or sharp intake of breath near the altar just before the fatal thud. Details that transformed the apparent accident into something far more sinister and deliberate. As the interviews concluded, Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection in the small vestry, his fingers drumming a thoughtful pattern on the wooden table, while the little gray cells began their intricate work of analyzing the fragments of truth and deception he had gathered from each witness. The puzzle pieces were scattered before him like the shattered glass that had surrounded Canon Whitmore's body, each interview revealing both crucial information and carefully concealed secrets, while the pattern of guilt and innocence remained tantalizingly just beyond complete comprehension, waiting for that final revelation that would illuminate the darkness and expose the murderer who walked among them with such carefully maintained composure. The morning light filtering through St. Bartholomew's restored windows cast jeweled patterns across the ancient stones with haunting beauty, their medieval craftsmanship now forever shadowed by the violence that had occurred beneath their sacred gaze. While Hercule Poirot arrived at precisely 9 o'clock with the punctuality that marked all his professional endeavors. Inspector Meadows greeted him with grudging respect, having spent the early hours reviewing the preliminary evidence and consulting with the police surgeon, whose more detailed examination had confirmed additional injuries to Canon Whitmore's skull, consistent with a deliberate blow before the fatal fall, transforming what had appeared to be a tragic accident into something far more sinister. The cathedral stood empty now except for the investigators, its silence broken only by the distant murmur of London traffic and the occasional creak of ancient timbers settling, while proper lighting had replaced the harsh emergency illumination, revealing every detail of the crime scene with stark clarity that made the scattered glass fragments glitter like crystallized accusations against the dark stone floor. Poirot began his renewed examination with characteristic methodical precision, first studying the electrical system that had so conveniently failed at the crucial moment, his keen eyes tracing the path of modern wiring that Dr. Fleming had installed with such meticulous care, only to have it sabotaged by someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral's layout and access to areas normally restricted to authorized personnel. The main circuit breaker showed unmistakable evidence of deliberate tampering, the connections loosened just enough to ensure failure under load, but not so obviously damaged as to suggest immediate sabotage, a technique that required both electrical knowledge and careful planning to execute without detection during the ceremony's solemn proceedings. Near the control panel, Poirot discovered a tiny flake of dark red material lodged at the base of the main toggle switch, which he lifted delicately on a slip of paper while noting its resemblance to the sealing wax traditionally used for important church correspondence, suggesting someone accustomed to formal procedures and ceremonial attention to detail. The discovery that Dr. Fleming's key to the electrical controls was missing from the vestry safe, despite his claims of having returned it that afternoon, added another troubling dimension to the investigation, particularly when combined with the evidence of recent tampering and the precise timing required to coordinate the blackout with Canon Whitmore's position near the altar. Inspector Meadows watched with growing admiration as Poirot reconstructed the sequence of events, explaining how the killer had used the ceremony's predictable timing to ensure the electrical failure would occur at precisely the moment when the canon stood alone, creating the perfect opportunity for murder, while providing the darkness necessary to conceal the crime from the assembled witnesses. The fragments of stained glass scattered around the victim's body told their own story under Poirot's expert analysis, revealing patterns that confirmed his initial suspicions about the nature of the attack. For their distribution and angle indicated deliberate placement rather than the random scatter that would result from a desperate grasp for support during an accidental fall. Most significantly, Poirot's careful examination of the glass fragments revealed a crucial detail that had escaped the initial investigation. Several pieces showed the clear characteristics of medieval pot metal glass, thick with ancient bubbles and bearing the patina of centuries, while others displayed the telltale clarity of modern restoration. Work masquerading as authentic antiquity. This discovery suggested that the crime involved not merely murder, but also the systematic replacement of priceless medieval glass with clever forgeries, a deception that would require extensive expertise in art authentication and access to the restoration work over an extended period. The implications were staggering, for such a scheme would involve substantial sums of money and provide compelling motives for eliminating anyone who might discover the fraud, particularly someone with Canon Whitmore's scholarly knowledge and unwavering commitment to historical authenticity. As Poirot continued his methodical investigation, he sought out Miss Caroline Fletcher, finding her standing beneath the great rose window where the morning light transformed her pale features into a study of grief and apprehension. Her composure finally cracked under gentle questioning. revealing that Canon Whitmore had indeed been troubled in recent weeks, having discovered what he termed irregularities in the Restoration Committee's financial accounts and expressing concerns about the provenance of certain pieces, particularly a roundel depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes that Dr. Fleming had championed as authentic, despite the canon's growing doubts about its medieval origins. She whispered that the canon had planned to address these concerns after the dedication ceremony, fearing that scandal would damage the cathedral's reputation and the restoration project's success. But his sense of duty had ultimately demanded that the truth be revealed regardless of the consequences to those involved. The revelation of Timothy Ashford's financial difficulties provided another piece of the puzzle, as his nervous confession to bridging the accounts with funds that had failed to materialize from a pledged donation created a compelling motive for wishing Canon Whitmore's scrutiny to cease permanently. His terror at the prospect of exposure was genuine enough. Yet Poirot's experienced eye detected that the treasurer's guilt extended only to financial impropriety rather than murder, though his desperate situation might have made him vulnerable to manipulation by someone with darker purposes. Dr. Fleming's expertise in medieval art and his intimate knowledge of the restoration process positioned him perfectly to orchestrate the systematic replacement of authentic pieces with forgeries, while his control over the electrical system provided the means to create the blackout that concealed the canon's murder when his scholarly integrity threatened to expose the entire scheme. Lady Pemberton's correspondence with Canon Whitmore, reluctantly surrendered under police pressure, revealed escalating tensions over the project's direction and priorities, their disagreements centering on questions of historical authenticity versus practical considerations that had created significant friction within the committee's leadership. Her letters displayed growing frustration with what she termed the canon's inflexible adherence to academic principles, while his responses maintained scholarly precision that barely concealed his irritation with attempts to rush aspects of the work that required careful authentication. Colonel Hartwell's military background had instilled tactical awareness that made him a keen observer, yet that same training would have provided skills necessary to plan and execute murder with precision, using the cathedral's layout and ceremony timing to maximum advantage, while his apparent financial security masked recent investment losses that might have made him susceptible to corruption. As the morning progressed, Poirot assembled these fragments of evidence and motive into a coherent pattern, recognizing that Canon Whitmore's murder had been committed not in a moment of passion, but as the calculated culmination of a sophisticated fraud that had been years in the making. The killer had used the dedication ceremony as the perfect cover for eliminating the one person whose scholarly expertise and moral integrity posed an insurmountable threat to their scheme, transforming a celebration of artistic preservation into a scene of violence that would forever stain the sacred space. The little gray cells worked with increasing intensity as Poirot contemplated the psychological profile of someone capable of such elaborate deception, someone who could maintain a facade of respectability while systematically looting the cathedral's priceless heritage and ultimately committing murder to protect their crimes from exposure. Standing once more beneath the great rose window where Canon Whitmore had fallen, Poirot reflected on the bitter irony that the man's dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, while the killer walked among them with carefully maintained composure, believing their elaborate deception had succeeded in transforming murder into apparent accident. The truth, like the intricate patterns of the stained glass windows themselves, was composed of many small pieces that required careful arrangement to reveal the complete picture, and Poirot knew that the moment of revelation was approaching when all would be made clear in the harsh light of justice. The afternoon brought Inspector Meadows back to St. Bartholomew's with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had found his quarry, though Hercule Poirot observed the inspector's confidence with the patient interest of someone who had witnessed many such premature celebrations of justice. The breakthrough had come through methodical police work, Meadows explained with evident pride, as his constables had discovered the missing electrical key to the cathedral's lighting system tucked within the inner pocket of Dr. Marcus Fleming's overcoat, which had been hanging in the vestry during the fatal ceremony. The art historian's protests of innocence rang hollow against this damning physical evidence, particularly when combined with Miss Caroline Fletcher's reluctant admission that she had observed him near the electrical controls during the service's final moments. His scholarly hands, moving with what she now realized, might have been sinister purpose rather than mere professional attention to detail. Dr. Fleming's face had gone ashen as Inspector Meadows produced the key with theatrical flourish, his usual scholarly composure cracking under the weight of circumstantial evidence that seemed to paint him as the calculating murderer who had used his intimate knowledge of the cathedral's systems to create the perfect opportunity for eliminating Canon Whitmore. His expertise in medieval glass authentication positioned him ideally to orchestrate the systematic replacement of authentic pieces with forgeries, while his control over the restoration project's technical aspects provided both means and opportunity to commit murder when the canon's scholarly integrity threatened to expose the entire fraudulent scheme. The inspector's men had already begun searching Fleming's office and lodgings, discovering correspondence with continental dealers that suggested a network of questionable transactions involving the cathedral's priceless windows, while sealed packets of red sealing wax found among his papers matched the mysterious flake discovered near the sabotaged electrical controls. Yet Hercule Poirot remained conspicuously unmoved by this apparently decisive development, his gray eyes studying Dr. Fleming's coat with the methodical attention he typically reserved for the most crucial pieces of evidence, his immaculate fingers tracing the garment's construction, while his mind processed details that seemed to escape Inspector Meadows's notice. When he requested permission to examine the coat more thoroughly, Poirot's observations proved characteristically penetrating, noting that while the outer fabric showed clear signs of exposure to the morning's drizzle, the inner pocket where the key had been discovered remained completely dry, suggesting that the evidence had been planted after the garment's owner had come in from the weather. The stitching around the pocket showed signs of recent stress, indicating that something bulkier than a simple key had been forced within, while the key itself bore none of the microscopic debris one would expect from extended contact with fabric that had been worn during active movement around the cathedral's dusty restoration areas. Inspector Meadows dismissed these observations as the overthinking of a mind too accustomed to complexity, arguing that evidence was evidence regardless of minor inconsistencies. But Poirot's gentle persistence revealed additional troubling details that cast doubt upon the neat resolution the inspector so eagerly embraced. Dr. Fleming's genuine distress seemed inconsistent with the cold calculation required for premeditated murder, while his immediate offer to provide references from respected colleagues across Europe suggested a man confident in his professional integrity rather than someone desperately attempting to conceal systematic fraud. Most significantly, his technical knowledge of the electrical system, while sufficient to identify potential points of failure, lacked the practical experience necessary to execute sabotage with the precision evident in the crime scene, suggesting that someone with more hands-on expertise had been responsible for the actual tampering. Lady Pemberton's reaction to Dr. Fleming's apparent guilt provided another piece of the puzzle that troubled Poirot's methodical mind, for her relief seemed disproportionate to her stated concerns about the cathedral's reputation, while her immediate suggestions about resuming the restoration work displayed unseemly haste for someone supposedly devastated by recent events. Timothy Ashford's nervous energy had transformed into something approaching panic as the investigation's focus shifted toward art fraud rather than simple financial irregularities, his pale face bearing the telltale signs of a man whose minor crimes might be overshadowed by far more serious accusations. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing remained unchanged, yet his tactical assessment of the evidence showed the kind of professional interest that might indicate either innocent curiosity or guilty knowledge, while his ready acceptance of Dr. Fleming's guilt suggested either genuine belief or convenient misdirection, Miss Caroline Fletcher's obvious distress at seeing her scholarly mentor accused of murder seemed entirely genuine. Yet Poirot detected subtle signs that her grief was complicated by knowledge she had not yet shared, particularly regarding Canon Whitmore's final conversations about the restoration project's integrity and his growing concerns about certain authentication procedures. Her father's friendship with the canon had provided opportunities to observe irregularities that extended beyond simple financial embezzlement, while her intimate involvement in the cathedral's charitable work positioned her to notice discrepancies between official accounts and actual expenditures that might reveal the true scope of the conspiracy. As evening approached and Inspector Meadows prepared to formalize charges against Dr. Fleming, Poirot requested one final examination of the crime scene, explaining with characteristic courtesy that certain psychological elements of the case required clarification before he could reconcile the physical evidence with the accused man's character and capabilities. His methodical review of the electrical sabotage confirmed his growing suspicions about the inadequacy of the obvious explanation, while his analysis of the glass fragments revealed patterns that suggested knowledge and planning beyond what Dr. Fleming possessed. The little grey cells worked with increasing intensity as Poirot contemplated the true nature of the conspiracy that had claimed Canon Whitmore's life, recognizing that while the scholar might indeed be guilty of art fraud, the more serious crime of murder required capabilities and motivations that pointed toward a different perpetrator entirely. Someone who had used Dr. Fleming's obvious guilt in lesser matters to obscure their own far more deadly involvement in the cathedral's transformation from sacred space to scene of calculated violence. Standing once more beneath the great rose window where Canon Whitmore had fallen, Poirot reflected on the bitter irony that the man's dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, while the true killer remained hidden behind carefully constructed facades of respectability and misdirection, confident that their elaborate deception would succeed in transforming murder into apparent justice, served upon a convenient scapegoat whose lesser crimes made him the perfect candidate for bearing responsibility for sins far greater than his own. The grey afternoon light filtering through St. Bartholomew's windows seemed to cast everything in shades of doubt as Hercule Poirot contemplated the inadequacy of Inspector Meadows's neat solution, recognizing that while Dr. Fleming might indeed be guilty of art fraud, the psychological profile required for premeditated murder demanded different capabilities entirely. The Belgian detective had spent the morning in careful observation of human nature rather than physical evidence, his little grey cells working through the intricate patterns of behavior that had emerged during the previous day's interviews, each suspect's reactions revealing far more than their carefully chosen words about their true knowledge of Canon Whitmore's death. Poirot understood that the key to unraveling this mystery lay not in fingerprints or bloodstains, but in the subtle contradictions of human psychology under pressure, the involuntary betrayals of manner that no amount of preparation could entirely conceal from someone trained to observe the delicate interplay between conscious deception and unconscious revelation. Inspector Meadows found himself reluctantly agreeing to Poirot's request for one final gathering of the suspects, though he remained convinced that Dr. Fleming's guilt was established beyond reasonable doubt, the physical evidence seeming overwhelming despite the Belgian detective's persistent observations about inconsistencies that might trouble a more imaginative mind. The small chapter house provided an intimate setting that would allow Poirot to observe each suspect's reactions with the precision of a jeweler examining a stone for flaws, its confined space ensuring that no gesture or glance could escape his methodical attention. Lady Pemberton arrived with her characteristic punctuality, her steel-grey composure showing definite signs of strain beneath the surface control, while Timothy Ashford clutched his ledgers with the desperate intensity of a man seeking refuge in numbers when confronted with the possibility of exposure for crimes far beyond simple financial irregularities. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing remained unchanged, yet Poirot detected something calculating in his pale blue eyes, a tactical assessment of the situation that suggested either innocent curiosity or the professional evaluation of threats and opportunities by someone accustomed to strategic thinking under pressure. Miss Caroline Fletcher appeared genuinely distressed by Dr. Fleming's plight, her obvious affection for her former mentor creating an emotional vulnerability that might prove useful in penetrating the careful facades that had protected the true conspiracy from discovery. Dr. Fleming himself bore the haggard expression of a man whose scholarly world had collapsed around him, though his continued protests of innocence regarding the murder carried the ring of truth that Poirot's experienced ear could distinguish from mere desperation. Poirot began with a seemingly innocent demonstration, producing a small mock-up of the cathedral's electrical system that he had commissioned from the church electrician, explaining with characteristic courtesy that he wished to understand the technical requirements for the sabotage that had created the fatal blackout. As he deliberately misnamed certain components and reversed the positions of switches, he watched with keen interest as several suspects showed involuntary signs of technical knowledge, their faces betraying familiarity with electrical systems that extended far beyond what their stated backgrounds would suggest. Colonel Hartwell's eyebrows drew together at the incorrect terminology, while Lady Pemberton's gloved hand twitched toward the demonstration as if to correct the obvious errors. Reactions that revealed practical expertise inconsistent with their claimed ignorance of such matters. The psychological pressure of the demonstration began to reveal cracks in the carefully maintained facades, particularly when Poirot mentioned the distinctive red sealing wax found near the sabotaged electrical controls, noting its resemblance to the formal materials used for official church correspondence and committee communications. Lady Pemberton's jaw tightened with what might have been guilty recognition, while her immediate attempt to deflect attention toward Dr. Fleming's supposed guilt displayed the kind of calculated misdirection that suggested intimate knowledge of the true circumstances surrounding Canon Whitmore's death. Colonel Hartwell's tactical silence became increasingly significant as Poirot outlined the planning and precision required for the crime, his military training providing exactly the skills necessary to coordinate the electrical sabotage with the victim's position and the ceremony's predictable timing. When Poirot gently questioned Timothy Ashford about the financial irregularities that had motivated his desperate attempts to balance the accounts before Canon Whitmore's planned audit, the treasurer's nervous confession revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had been operating beneath the Restoration Committee's respectable facade. His admission of bridging funds from pledged donations that had never materialized created a compelling motive for wishing the canon's investigation to cease permanently, though Poirot's experienced eye detected that Ashford's guilt extended only to financial impropriety rather than the more serious crime of murder. Miss Fletcher's obvious distress at these revelations seemed entirely genuine, yet her darting glances toward specific members of the group suggested knowledge or suspicions that she had not yet found the courage to voice. Her father's friendship with Canon Whitmore having provided opportunities to observe irregularities that extended far beyond simple embezzlement. The true breakthrough came when Poirot mentioned the roundel depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes, noting casually that only someone with extensive knowledge of medieval glass would recognize the subtle differences between authentic pot metal and modern reproductions, particularly in pieces where the lead lines crossed distinctive features that served as authentication markers. Lady Pemberton's involuntary reaction to this observation, a brief closing of her eyes that betrayed guilty knowledge, combined with Colonel Hartwell's sharp tap of his walking stick and what might have been an old soldier's unconscious salute to a well-placed shot, revealed the psychological impact of Poirot's carefully chosen words. The little grey cells worked with increasing intensity as these fragments of truth and deception began forming a coherent pattern, one that pointed toward a sophisticated conspiracy involving the systematic replacement of priceless medieval art with profitable forgeries, a scheme that required both Lady Pemberton's administrative authority and Colonel Hartwell's technical expertise to execute successfully. As the gathering concluded, Poirot reflected on the bitter irony that Canon Whitmore's dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, while the true conspirators maintained their facades of respectability, confident that Dr. Fleming's obvious guilt in lesser matters would provide perfect cover for their far more serious crimes. The sacred windows of St. Bartholomew's, looking down upon this scene of human corruption with the eternal judgment of centuries. The evening shadows lengthened across St. Bartholomew's ancient stones as Hercule Poirot contemplated the inadequacy of obvious solutions. His little grey cells working through the psychological complexities that Inspector Meadows's straightforward approach had failed to address. The Belgian detective had spent the afternoon in careful observation of human nature, recognizing that while Dr. Fleming might indeed be guilty of art fraud, the cold calculation required for premeditated murder demanded different capabilities entirely. The inspector found himself reluctantly agreeing to Poirot's request for one final informal gathering of the Restoration Committee, ostensibly to discuss the project's future in light of recent tragic events, though Poirot's true purpose involved applying psychological pressure to force the real killer into revealing themselves through desperate action. The cathedral's night watchman discovered the first sign of this desperation during his early morning rounds, finding the vestry door ajar and Canon Whitmore's personal effects cabinet forced open with professional precision. Poirot arrived within the hour, his methodical examination revealing that the break-in had been conducted by someone seeking specific information rather than valuables, for nothing of monetary worth had been taken, while papers lay scattered with the telltale signs of a frantic search. Most significantly, Canon Whitmore's private ledger, described by Miss Caroline Fletcher as containing his detailed observations about the restoration project's irregularities, had vanished completely, confirming Poirot's growing suspicion that the murder was intrinsically linked to a sophisticated art fraud conspiracy that extended far beyond simple financial embezzlement. The theft of the ledger sent ripples of unease through the already shaken committee members, their reactions providing Poirot with valuable insights into the true nature of the conspiracy that had claimed Canon Whitmore's life. Lady Pemberton's outrage at the break-in seemed tinged with defensive anxiety, while her immediate suggestions about securing the remaining restoration materials displayed unseemly haste for someone supposedly devastated by recent events. Colonel Hartwell's tactical assessment of the security breach showed professional interest that might indicate either innocent military expertise or guilty knowledge of the operation's requirements, while Timothy Ashford's terror at the possibility that financial records might have been the target revealed a man whose minor crimes had made him vulnerable to manipulation by those with darker purposes. Miss Caroline Fletcher's quiet certainty that Canon Whitmore had discovered something dangerous proved prophetic when she approached Poirot that evening with trembling hands and the desperate urgency of someone whose conscience could no longer bear concealed knowledge. Her whispered confession revealed that she had witnessed Lady Pemberton leaving her designated position during the fatal ceremony's final moments, moving with purpose toward the chancel where Canon Whitmore stood alone. Her return to the pew occurring just before the electrical failure with timing that suggested careful coordination rather than coincidental movement. Most significantly, Miss Fletcher had observed traces of red sealing wax on Lady Pemberton's gloves upon her return, the distinctive material that Poirot had discovered near the sabotaged electrical controls, providing a crucial link between the committee chairwoman and the technical aspects of the crime. The revelation of Colonel Hartwell's role as Lady Pemberton's accomplice emerged through Miss Fletcher's reluctant admission that she had observed the military gentleman conducting what he termed security inspections near the electrical systems, his familiarity with the cathedral's layout and his tactical expertise providing the skills necessary to coordinate the sabotage with Canon Whitmore's predicted position during the ceremony. The partnership between the imperious committee chairwoman and the calculating former soldier represented a formidable combination of administrative authority and technical precision, their complementary abilities enabling them to orchestrate both the systematic replacement of priceless medieval windows with profitable forgeries and the murder that protected their elaborate deception from exposure by Canon Whitmore's scholarly integrity. The psychological pressure of these revelations, combined with the missing ledger's implications, created the perfect conditions for Poirot's carefully orchestrated trap, as he announced to the assembled committee that he had placed certain decisive evidence in safekeeping and would present his findings to church authorities the following morning. The effect was immediate and dramatic, for within hours, Timothy Ashford was discovered hanging in the cathedral's bell tower, an apparent suicide, accompanied by a detailed confession claiming responsibility for both the financial irregularities and Canon Whitmore's murder. His note describing a moment of panic and confusion that had led to the scholar's death during the electrical failure. Inspector Meadows accepted this convenient resolution with relief, eager to close a case that had grown increasingly complex. But Poirot's experienced eye detected numerous inconsistencies that betrayed the confession's fraudulent nature. The handwriting, while superficially resembling Ashford's nervous script, contained subtle differences in letter formation that suggested careful forgery, while the formal language and ecclesiastical terminology were inconsistent with the treasurer's usual manner of expression. Most tellingly, the ligature showed the neat precision of someone with military training rather than the desperate improvisation of a man driven to suicide by guilt, while the positioning of the body and the absence of expected physical evidence suggested careful staging by someone with tactical knowledge of such operations. The discovery that Ashford had been murdered to provide a convenient scapegoat confirmed Poirot's analysis of the conspiracy's ruthless nature, while the killer's choice of victim revealed both desperation and calculated misdirection, for the treasurer's obvious guilt in financial matters made him the perfect candidate for bearing responsibility for far more serious crimes. Lady Pemberton's immediate acceptance of the suicide explanation, combined with her suggestions for resuming normal cathedral operations, displayed the kind of administrative efficiency that might seem admirable under different circumstances, but now appeared as evidence of cold-blooded calculation in the aftermath of a second murder designed to protect her elaborate fraud from discovery. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing remained unchanged throughout these developments, yet his tactical silence and systematic observation of the proceedings suggested a mind already planning contingencies for the possibility that their desperate gambit might fail to satisfy Poirot's relentless investigation. The partnership between these two conspirators had operated with the precision of a military campaign, using their positions of trust and authority to systematically loot the cathedral's artistic heritage, while maintaining facades of respectability that had protected them from suspicion until Canon Whitmore's scholarly expertise had threatened to expose their crimes. As the evening concluded with Ashford's body removed, and the official investigation apparently closed, Poirot stood once more beneath the great rose window where Canon Whitmore had fallen, reflecting on the bitter irony that the scholar's dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, while his murder had been followed by a second killing designed to obscure the truth behind layers of misdirection and false confession. The little grey cells worked with increasing intensity as the Belgian detective contemplated the final moves necessary to expose the real killers, recognizing that Lady Pemberton and Colonel Hartwell's apparent success in eliminating both their primary threat and their chosen scapegoat had only delayed the inevitable moment when justice would illuminate the darkness that had desecrated this sacred space with calculated violence and systematic corruption. The grey morning light filtering through St. Bartholomew's windows found Hercule Poirot in a state of methodical dissatisfaction, his little grey cells refusing to accept Inspector Meadows' convenient resolution despite the apparent neatness of Timothy Ashford's confession and subsequent suicide. The Belgian detective had spent the early hours revisiting the bell tower where the treasurer's body had been discovered, his trained eye detecting anomalies that spoke of careful staging rather than desperate self-destruction. The rope itself told a story of military precision, its knots displaying the kind of disciplined efficiency that Colonel Hartwell might execute in his sleep, while the positioning of the overturned stool suggested calculation rather than the chaotic final moments of a man driven to desperation by guilt and exposure. Most significantly, Poirot discovered a tiny smudge of dark green paint on a grimy beam high above the bell tower floor, its distinctive shade matching precisely the decorative motifs recently applied to the restored window frames throughout the cathedral. This seemingly insignificant detail resonated with profound implications, suggesting that someone familiar with the restoration work had been present during Ashford's final moments, their clothing or equipment making contact with freshly painted surfaces during what should have been a private act of self-destruction. The paint's presence in such an unlikely location spoke volumes about the true nature of events in the bell tower, transforming apparent suicide into carefully orchestrated murder designed to eliminate a potential witness while providing authorities with a convenient scapegoat for Canon Whitmore's death. The breakthrough came when Miss Caroline Fletcher approached Poirot with trembling hands, clutching a leather portfolio that had belonged to her late father, its contents revealing the true scope of the conspiracy that had claimed 2 lives within the cathedral's sacred walls. Her father's meticulous documentation, compiled during years of friendship with Canon Whitmore, included detailed photographs and provenance records for every window in the restoration project, creating an invaluable archive that exposed the systematic replacement of authentic medieval glass with sophisticated forgeries over nearly 3 years. The portfolio contained correspondence discussing growing concerns about certain pieces, particularly the roundel depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes, whose subtle anomalies in leadwork and glass composition suggested modern manufacture disguised with artificial aging techniques. Poirot examined these documents with the reverent attention of a scholar confronting primary sources, recognizing that Miss Fletcher's courage had provided crucial missing pieces necessary to complete his understanding of the conspiracy's intricate structure. The photographs revealed microscopic variations in glass thickness and bubble patterns that distinguished authentic pot metal from modern reproductions, while financial records exposed staggering profits from sales to private collectors through continental dealers specializing in questionable provenance. Lady Pemberton's administrative authority had provided perfect cover for the systematic replacement process, her imperious manner discouraging questions from subordinates who might otherwise have noticed irregularities in the project's progress. The evidence of Colonel Hartwell's tactical expertise became increasingly apparent as Poirot reconstructed the conspiracy's operational requirements, recognizing that the military gentleman's knowledge of security procedures and logistical planning had proved invaluable in coordinating the complex theft and replacement operations. His physical strength and familiarity with the cathedral's layout, gained during restoration oversight, positioned him perfectly to execute both Canon Whitmore's murder and Ashford's subsequent elimination when the treasurer's nervous disposition made him, beside, liability rather than an asset to the criminal enterprise. Perhaps most damning was Poirot's discovery in Canon Whitmore's vestry of a faint indentation in the velvet lining of the sealing wax box, its precise shape and size matching the family crest signet ring that Lady Pemberton had conspicuously removed before her second interview, claiming it chafed her finger. This subtle detail, combined with the red sealing wax found near the sabotaged electrical controls, created an unbreakable chain of evidence connecting the committee chairwoman directly to both the technical aspects of Canon Whitmore's murder and the forged confession that had accompanied Ashford's staged suicide. The psychological profile of someone capable of such elaborate deception required the kind of calculating intelligence that Lady Pemberton displayed in all her administrative endeavors. her imperious manner concealing a mind that viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of financial gain. The international scope of the conspiracy became clear through documentation revealing connections between St. Bartholomew's thefts and a broader network of art fraud involving cathedrals and museums across Europe, with Lady Pemberton's high society connections providing access to collectors willing to purchase stolen artifacts without excessive scrutiny regarding their provenance. Colonel Hartwell's military contacts had established secure transportation routes and storage facilities, while his understanding of tactical operations enabled the conspirators to anticipate and counter potential threats to their elaborate deception. As evening approached, Poirot reflected on the bitter irony that Canon Whitmore's scholarly dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately sealed his fate, while Timothy Ashford's minor financial irregularities had made him the perfect scapegoat for far more serious crimes. The conspirators' apparent success in eliminating both their primary threat and their chosen fall guy represented the culmination of years of careful planning, yet their very meticulousness had ultimately provided the evidence necessary to expose their guilt. The little grey cells worked with increasing intensity as the Belgian detective contemplated the final moves necessary to bring Lady Pemberton and Colonel Hartwell to justice, recognizing that their apparent triumph had only delayed the inevitable moment when truth would illuminate the darkness that had transformed St. Bartholomew's sacred space into a scene of calculated violence and systematic corruption, the medieval windows looking down with eternal judgment upon those who had perverted their beauty into instruments of greed and murder. Standing beneath the great rose window where Canon Whitmore had fallen, Poirot understood that the approaching confrontation would require all his psychological expertise to penetrate the facades that had protected the conspirators from suspicion, while the evidence Miss Fletcher's courage had provided would serve as the foundation for exposing crimes that extended far beyond the cathedral's ancient walls into a network of corruption that had claimed victims across Europe. The ancient chapter house of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral had witnessed centuries of ecclesiastical deliberations, but never had its oak-paneled walls contained such an atmosphere of tense expectation as they did on this grey November afternoon. Hercule Poirot stood with characteristic precision at the head of the long table, his egg-shaped head tilted thoughtfully while his grey eyes surveyed the assembled company with the methodical attention of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex work. Inspector Meadows occupied a chair near the Gothic windows, his professional skepticism gradually giving way to grudging respect for the Belgian detective's uncanny insights, while the police surgeon waited discreetly by the door, prepared for whatever revelations might emerge from this final gathering. Lady Pemberton entered with her imperious bearing intact, though Poirot's experienced eye detected subtle signs of strain beneath her carefully maintained composure. The slight tremor in her gloved hands and the defensive set of her shoulders betraying the psychological pressure of someone whose elaborate deception was approaching its inevitable exposure. Colonel Hartwell maintained his military posture with disciplined precision, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick with unconscious readiness, while his pale blue eyes showed the calculating wariness of a tactical mind assessing threats and opportunities. Miss Caroline Fletcher sat pale but determined near the entrance, her father's leather portfolio resting securely before her, while Dr. Fleming attended under police escort, his scholarly features bearing the haggard expression of a man whose world had collapsed around him. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with gentle courtesy, his precise continental accent cutting through the charged atmosphere like a blade through silk. "We gather today to restore order to this house of God, to illuminate the darkness that has desecrated these sacred stones with calculated violence and systematic corruption." His voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to speaking uncomfortable truth, while the colored light from the great nave windows cast jeweled patterns across the assembled faces, their beauty now forever shadowed by the crimes that had been committed beneath their sacred gaze. Poirot began his exposition by dismantling the convenient fiction that had briefly satisfied official investigation, explaining with characteristic precision how the electrical key discovered in Dr. Fleming's coat had been planted with amateur theatricality that insulted the intelligence of anyone trained to observe human behavior under pressure. The outer fabric showed clear signs of exposure to morning drizzle. He noted with the patience of a professor addressing particularly slow students, yet the inner pocket where this crucial evidence was discovered remained virginally dry, while the stitching bore the unmistakable strain of a foreign object forced where it did not belong. Dr. Fleming's visible relief at this vindication was tempered by his obvious shame at having allowed scholarly vanity to blind him to the conspiracy that had operated beneath the Restoration Committee's respectable facade. The revelation of Timothy Ashford's murder, disguised as suicide to provide a convenient scapegoat for Canon Whitmore's death, exposed the conspiracy's ruthless willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations, while the forged confession bore subtle signs that betrayed its true authorship. The rope itself tells a story of military precision, Poirot continued, his grey eyes fixed on Colonel Hartwell's increasingly rigid posture, its knots displaying the kind of disciplined efficiency that speaks of parade ground training rather than the desperate improvisation of a man driven to self-destruction by guilt. Most significantly, the tiny smudge of dark green paint discovered on a grimy beam high above the bell tower floor matched precisely the distinctive shade used in the cathedral's restoration work, providing irrefutable proof that someone familiar with the project had been present during Ashford's final moments. Miss Caroline Fletcher's courage in presenting her father's meticulous documentation transformed speculation into certainty, her trembling voice recounting the photographic evidence that revealed systematic forgery extending across nearly 3 years of careful planning and execution. The portfolio contained correspondence discussing growing concerns about specific pieces, particularly the roundel depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes, whose subtle anomalies in leadwork and glass composition had first alerted Canon Whitmore to the deception that would ultimately cost him his life. The authentic glass went abroad through continental dealers, Poirot explained, his methodical reconstruction of the conspiracy's scope revealing profits that extended far beyond simple theft into a network of international art fraud, while sophisticated forgeries returned to us with certificates as respectable as their sponsors. The psychological pressure of this methodical exposition began to crack the carefully maintained facades that had protected the conspirators from suspicion, Lady Pemberton's imperious manner giving way to defensive anger as she attempted to deflect attention toward Dr. Fleming's obvious guilt in authentication fraud. Yet Poirot's revelation of the distinctive red sealing wax found near the sabotaged electrical controls, combined with the telltale impression of her family crest signet ring in the vestry's wax box, created an unbreakable chain of evidence connecting the committee chairwoman directly to the technical aspects of Canon Whitmore's murder. The flake of wax bore the ghost of a crest, he observed with deadly precision, while the lady who so admirably chairs our restoration works removed her ring for comfort only after it had completed its evening duty. Colonel Hartwell's tactical expertise became increasingly apparent as Poirot reconstructed the murder's military precision, the coordination of electrical sabotage with Canon Whitmore's predicted position during the ceremony, displaying the kind of operational planning that only years of partnership could achieve. One requires authority, and one requires logistics, Poirot noted, his gaze moving between the two conspirators whose mutual accusations and offensive maneuvering provided final confirmation of their guilt. And the union of these virtues sat, week after week, at this very table to bless the accounts and inspect the scaffolding while systematically looting the cathedral's priceless heritage. As the weight of evidence mounted inexorably against them, Lady Pemberton's composure finally shattered completely. Her attempt to shift blame entirely onto Colonel Hartwell met by his cold acknowledgement of their partnership while maintaining that the murders had been necessary to protect their operations from discovery. Their mutual recriminations echoed through the ancient chapter house as Inspector Meadows prepared the formal charges that would bring justice for crimes that had transformed St. Bartholomew's sacred space into a scene of calculated violence, while the restored windows looked down with eternal judgment upon those who had perverted their beauty into instruments of greed and murder. The ancient chapter house of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral bore witness to its most extraordinary assembly as Hercule Poirot stood before the gathered suspects with the quiet authority of a man whose little grey cells had finally arranged the scattered pieces of truth into their proper pattern. Lady Pemberton maintained her imperious bearing despite the mounting evidence, while Colonel Hartwell's military posture showed the first signs of strain as the Belgian detective began his methodical exposition with characteristic precision. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his continental accent cutting through the charged atmosphere, "we have before us a crime of remarkable sophistication, one that required not merely opportunity, but the careful coordination of administrative authority and tactical expertise over a period of years." His grey eyes surveyed the assembly with the patience of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex work, noting how Lady Pemberton's gloved hands gripped her prayer book with unconscious tension, while Colonel Hartwell's weathered fingers tapped against his walking stick in what might have been nervous energy or calculated assessment of remaining options. The revelation began with the systematic art fraud that had provided both motive and method for Canon Whitmore's murder. Poirot explaining how authentic medieval glass had been replaced piece by piece with sophisticated forgeries, the profits from international sales, creating a lucrative enterprise that required Lady Pemberton's administrative control and Colonel Hartwell's logistical expertise. The roundel depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes was Canon Whitmore's final confirmation, Poirot noted with scholarly precision, for the lead line crossed the eyebrow where, in every authenticated example, the line yields to the painter's hand, a detail that only the most experienced eye would detect, but which condemned the entire operation once noticed. Miss Caroline Fletcher's father had documented these discrepancies with meticulous care, his photographs revealing microscopic variations in glass thickness and bubble patterns that distinguished authentic pot metal from modern reproductions, while financial records exposed the staggering profits that had motivated years of systematic deception. The technical aspects of Canon Whitmore's murder demonstrated the conspirators' deadly efficiency. Poirot reconstructing how Colonel Hartwell had sabotaged the electrical system with military precision, loosening connections just enough to ensure failure under load while using red sealing wax from the vestry to reseal the inspection panel, the wax bearing the faint impression of Lady Pemberton's family crest signet ring discovered through careful analysis of the flake found near the controls. The timing required intimate knowledge of the ceremony's progression, Poirot explained, his methodical analysis revealing how Lady Pemberton's position as chairwoman provided perfect intelligence about Canon Whitmore's movements, while Colonel Hartwell's tactical expertise enabled him to coordinate the blackout with the victim's isolation near the altar. The murder itself had been executed with cold calculation, a single blow delivered in darkness before the body was positioned to simulate an accidental fall, while scattered glass fragments from both authentic medieval pieces and modern forgeries created the illusion of a desperate grasp for support during the fatal tumble. Timothy Ashford's subsequent murder, disguised as suicide to provide a convenient scapegoat, revealed the conspiracy's ruthless willingness to eliminate potential witnesses, Colonel Hartwell's military training evident in the precise knots and careful staging that had briefly satisfied official investigation, until Poirot's discovery of green paint high above the bell tower floor exposed the killer's presence during what should have been a private act of self-destruction. The confession was forged with the ecclesiastical phrases of someone accustomed to composing committee minutes, Poirot observed, his analysis of the handwriting revealing subtle differences that betrayed Lady Pemberton's authorship, despite her attempts to imitate the treasurer's nervous script. The psychological pressure of these revelations finally cracked the Conspirators carefully maintained facades, Lady Pemberton's imperious composure dissolving into defensive accusations against her military accomplice, while Colonel Hartwell acknowledged their partnership with the cold pragmatism of a professional soldier accepting tactical defeat. Their mutual recriminations provided final confirmation of guilt as each attempted to minimize their own culpability while maximizing their accomplice's responsibility. Lady Pemberton insisting that her charitable instincts had been manipulated by military cunning, while Colonel Hartwell maintained that her aristocratic greed had driven the operation's expansion from simple profit-taking into international fraud and ultimately murder. Inspector Meadows watched with growing satisfaction as the case's complexities resolved into clear criminal responsibility. The evidence Poirot had assembled, creating an unbreakable chain connecting both conspirators to systematic art theft and premeditated murder. Dr. Fleming's vindication brought little comfort to a man whose scholarly reputation had been tainted by association with criminals who had exploited his expertise while concealing their true intentions, though his obvious relief at avoiding criminal charges was tempered by professional shame at having failed to detect the deception operating beneath his supervision. As the formal charges were read and the conspirators prepared for removal to police custody, Poirot reflected on the bitter irony that Canon Whitmore's dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, while the restored windows of St. Bartholomew's would forever bear silent witness to the triumph of truth over deception and light over the darkness that had temporarily desecrated their ancient beauty with calculated violence and systematic corruption. The ancient chapter house of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral witnessed its most extraordinary conclusion as Inspector Meadows formally placed Lady Pemberton and Colonel Hartwell under arrest, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking with ecclesiastical finality against the oak-paneled walls that had heard centuries of solemn deliberations. Lady Pemberton's imperious composure shattered completely in those final moments, her aristocratic mask dissolving into desperate fury as she launched accusations of incompetence and slander, her voice echoing shrilly through the sacred space while her trembling hands betrayed the psychological collapse of someone whose elaborate deception had been stripped away with surgical precision. Colonel Hartwell accepted his fate with the stoic resignation of a professional soldier confronting tactical defeat, his pale blue eyes maintaining their calculating assessment even as he acknowledged the thoroughness of Poirot's investigation with something approaching military respect for a worthy adversary. Within hours of their removal from the cathedral grounds, the machinery of international justice began its inexorable work as warrants spread across London and beyond, while continental authorities traced panels of authentic medieval glass to discreet private vaults in Paris, Antwerp, and Milan. The scope of the conspiracy proved even more extensive than Poirot had initially suspected, revealing a sophisticated network that had systematically looted ecclesiastical art from cathedrals across Europe, with St. Bartholomew's serving merely as one profitable node in a decade-long criminal enterprise. Inspector Meadows, whose initial skepticism had given way to grudging admiration for the Belgian detective's methods, personally supervised the recovery operations that would eventually restore millions of pounds worth of stolen artifacts to their rightful homes, while the forged pieces were catalogued as evidence of the conspirators' sophisticated deception. Dr. Fleming's vindication brought little immediate comfort to a scholar whose reputation had been tainted by unwitting association with such calculated corruption, though his obvious relief at avoiding criminal charges was tempered by professional shame at having failed to detect the systematic fraud operating beneath his supervision. He stood in the nave with Miss Caroline Fletcher, speaking not as the triumphant expert he had once been, but as a penitent scholar, offering his labor without fee until every false pane was identified and removed, his meticulous records now serving the cause of restoration rather than unknowing complicity in theft. Miss Fletcher herself had emerged from the ordeal with quiet strength, her father's legacy of careful documentation having proved crucial to exposing the conspiracy. though the weight of recent revelations had clearly marked her pale features with the gravity of someone who had witnessed the depths of human corruption within sacred walls. The legal proceedings that followed unfolded with the measured precision of ecclesiastical ritual, as Lady Pemberton's counsel attempted to argue philanthropy corrupted by unfortunate speculation. But the sealing wax evidence, the absent signet ring, the precisely timed electrical sabotage, and the trail of international art sales created an unbreakable chain of culpability. Colonel Hartwell, who had maintained his military bearing throughout the investigation, offered one final statement acknowledging that his tactical expertise had been perverted into criminal enterprise, though even his disciplined composure faltered when confronted with photographs of the shattered glass surrounding Canon Whitmore's body. The sentences, when they came, reflected the severity of crimes that had violated not merely legal statutes, but the sacred trust placed in those who guard cultural treasures, while orders followed to seize properties and accounts so that fragments of illicit wealth might provide restitution for the cathedral's wounded heritage. Timothy Ashford's name was quietly cleared in the official records, Inspector Meadows ensuring that the uneyed murdered treasurer would be remembered as a victim rather than a criminal, while a simple memorial service attended by Poirot himself honored a man whose minor financial irregularities had made him the perfect scapegoat for far more serious crimes. Canon Whitmore's requiem, held a fortnight later, filled the cathedral with mourners who came to honor a scholar whose dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life. The restored rose window pouring such bands of colored light upon the assembled congregation that even practical Inspector Meadows admitted it resembled a benediction from beyond. As the immediate crisis passed and the cathedral began its slow return to normal worship, Poirot found himself reflecting on the bitter ironies that had marked this case from beginning to end. Standing once more beneath the great rose window where Canon Whitmore had fallen, he contemplated how the scholar's unwavering commitment to authenticity had sealed his fate, while the very windows he had died protecting now shone with renewed clarity, their medieval craftsmanship freed from the shadow of systematic deception. The little grey cells had completed their work with characteristic thoroughness, illuminating not merely individual guilt, but the broader corruption that transformed sacred art into commercial commodity, while justice had restored the delicate balance between preservation and exploitation that defined the eternal struggle between human nobility and base criminality. In the quiet sacristy, where the faint perfume of wax and lavender clung to ancient oak, Inspector Meadows asked how Poirot had known which heart harbored the deepest corruption, and the Belgian detective replied with gentle precision that evil betrays itself not through fingerprints, but through impatience with moral limits and contempt for small decencies. The conspirators had believed that committee authority could transform theft into restoration, and that calculated murder could be disguised as tragic accident. But they had forgotten that truth, like the intricate patterns of stained glass itself, emerges when all pieces are properly arranged according to their authentic design. As Poirot took his final leave of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, pausing at the north door to admire once more the rose window's eternal judgment, he reflected that glass teaches the ultimate lesson about character, yielding to light or imprisoning it according to the integrity of its making, while the restored windows would forever bear witness to the triumph of truth over elaborate deception. The winter morning brought crystalline clarity to St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, its restored windows casting jeweled patterns across ancient stones with a luminous quality that seemed to celebrate the triumph of truth over elaborate deception. Hercule Poirot stood in the nave for his final visit, his grey eyes surveying the scene where Canon Whitmore had fallen with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had restored proper order to a world briefly disrupted by calculated violence and systematic corruption. The cathedral had resumed its normal rhythms of worship and contemplation, though the events of recent weeks had left subtle changes in the atmosphere, a heightened awareness that even sacred spaces were not immune to human frailty and the corrupting influence of unchecked greed, while workmen moved quietly along the aisles, lifting the false panes into crates bound for police storage as authentic glass, recovered from discreet continental vaults, weighted under protective blankets like patients prepared for healing surgery. Inspector Meadows approached with the measured step of a man whose professional understanding had been permanently altered by exposure to methods that prioritized psychological insight over physical evidence, his handshake conveying both gratitude and the grudging respect of someone whose initial conclusions had been so thoroughly dismantled by superior analysis. The final reports from international authorities had confirmed the staggering scope of Lady Pemberton and Colonel Hartwell's conspiracy, revealing a sophisticated network that had systematically looted ecclesiastical art across Europe for nearly a decade, their partnership combining administrative authority with tactical precision to create what they believed was an unbreakable criminal enterprise until Canon Whitmore's scholarly integrity had threatened to expose their carefully constructed deception. Miss Caroline Fletcher had found unexpected strength in the aftermath, her father's meticulous documentation having proved crucial to exposing crimes that extended far beyond simple theft into premeditated murder designed to protect elaborate fraud from discovery. She moved through the cathedral with quiet purpose, supervising the careful identification and restoration of authentic pieces while coordinating with international experts who had volunteered their services to ensure that every recovered panel was properly returned to its rightful position. Dr. Fleming worked alongside her with the dedication of a penitent scholar offering his expertise without fee. His reputation vindicated, but his character marked by permanent humility about the limitations of knowledge when confronted by sophisticated criminal deception. His meticulous records now serving authentic restoration rather than unknowing complicity in international art theft. As the morning progressed toward its conclusion, Poirot found himself in conversation with Inspector Meadows near the great rose window, the policeman's curiosity finally overcoming his professional reserve as he asked the question that had troubled him since the beginning of their collaboration. The physical evidence was crucial, certainly, Meadows acknowledged, but how did you know which heart harbored the deepest corruption when all maintained such convincing facades? Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision, his response carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to illuminating the darkest corners of human nature through careful observation and psychological analysis. Mon ami, Poirot replied with gentle patience, the little grey cells do not merely collect facts, but arrange them according to the patterns of human psychology under pressure, for evil betrays itself, not through fingerprints, but through impatience with moral limits and contempt for small decencies. He gestured toward the restored windows with their eternal themes of judgment and redemption, explaining how Lady Pemberton's imperious manner had concealed a mind that viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of financial gain, while Colonel Hartwell's tactical expertise had provided the precision necessary to coordinate electrical sabotage with Canon Whitmore's predicted position during the ceremony's solemn proceedings. The legal consequences had unfolded with ecclesiastical solemnity, as both conspirators received sentences reflecting the international cooperation necessary to address art fraud on such an unprecedented scale, their seized assets providing substantial restitution for the cathedral's wounded heritage, while new authentication procedures would protect future restoration projects from similar exploitation by those who would pervert charitable work into criminal opportunity. Timothy Ashford's name had been quietly cleared in official records, Inspector Meadows ensuring that the murdered treasurer would be remembered as a victim rather than a criminal, while Canon Whitmore's memorial service had filled the cathedral with mourners honoring a scholar whose dedication to preserving authentic medieval art had ultimately cost him his life, yet simultaneously ensured that truth would eventually illuminate the darkness that had temporarily desecrated these sacred stones. Standing once more beneath the great rose window where the scholar had fallen, Poirot reflected on the bitter ironies that had marked this case from its violent beginning to its just conclusion, recognizing that Canon Whitmore's unwavering commitment to authenticity had sealed his fate while providing the foundation for exposing crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, transforming personal tragedy into public vindication of the principles that distinguish genuine scholarship from commercial exploitation disguised as charitable service. Miss Fletcher approached with a small brown paper parcel, her expression composed with dignified English reserve as she explained that her father would have appreciated the justice of Poirot's admiration for authentic beauty, even while condemning its counterfeit, offering a fragment of genuine medieval blue glass as remembrance rather than payment. As Poirot prepared to take his leave of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, he contemplated the eternal struggle between human nobility and base criminality that defined so many of his investigations, recognizing that the restored windows would forever bear witness to the triumph of truth over systematic deception and light over the darkness that had briefly corrupted this ancient space. The little gray cells had completed their work with characteristic thoroughness, illuminating not merely individual guilt, but the broader corruption that transformed sacred art into commercial commodity, while justice had restored the delicate balance between preservation and exploitation that protected cultural treasures from those who would sacrifice heritage for profit. The medieval craftsmanship continuing its eternal vigil over a space where order had finally conquered the forces of calculated deception and systematic corruption that had temporarily transformed sacred beauty into instruments of greed and murder.